They said it was just another meeting, another closed-door briefing in a dusty African capital. But what they didn't say, what they couldn't, was that the letter had already been delivered. Sealed in crimson wax, carried in silence, and bearing a symbol few had seen in years. On that night, the world shifted slightly, and only one man felt it. The wind whipped over Ouagadougou, cutting through the night like a whisper in the dark, inside a dimly lit room beneath a presidential compound. The air was heavy, not with smoke or heat, but with waiting. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely 36, leaned over a wooden desk with no nameplate. There were no aides, no generals, only him. A flickering bulb above cast dancing shadows over a blood-red envelope resting before him. No return address, just the seal, an ancient Persian lion holding a sword. The room, barely lit and eerily still, felt more like a vault than an office. Concrete walls, a dusty bookshelf, a single rifle leaning in the corner. Why had Iran contacted him so directly? He opened the envelope slowly, as if the paper might scream. Inside, a handwritten letter in Arabic and French. Short, formal, and terrifying in implication. Captain Traoré, your voice has risen. Your people have awakened. Africa listens. But so does the resistance. Come east, the moment approaches. Choose your side before the fire spreads. It was signed by a name he recognized from intelligence briefings. Major General Esmail Khani, the current head of Iran's Quds Force, the elite shadow arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Traoré exhaled slowly, fingers tightening. The Quds Force had never extended an invitation like this to an African leader before, especially not one in his 30s. Barely 2 years into a revolution of his own. But why him? Why now? That same evening across the city, 2 intelligence officers from Burkina Faso's G5 Sahel task force sat outside a warehouse with tinted windows. They weren't told why they were there, only that the package had arrived from Mashhad, Iran, under diplomatic cover. The warehouse was silent. No movement, no guards. But inside, a metal briefcase sat atop a table covered with black cloth. The cameras inside had been shut off. The case contained only 2 things: a single encrypted flash drive, with Quds Force schematics of Israeli surveillance outposts in Eritrea and Sudan, and a folded photograph of Ibrahim Traoré shaking hands with Vladimir Putin. What did they want? Back in the palace, Traoré stood in front of a map. His fingers ran across borders: Sudan, Iran, all interconnected through smuggled weapons, revolutionary rhetoric, and the silent suffering of thousands. He wasn't naive. He knew Iran wasn't reaching out for brotherhood. They wanted a proxy. They wanted Africa as a second front in their escalating shadow war with Israel. If you were offered power, protection, and partnership, but at the price of turning your country into a battlefield, and then a knock. Soft, deliberate, the only man allowed to knock at this hour stepped inside. Colonel Farouk, head of Traoré's personal security. He said just 2 words. They're here. They're here. 2 words that should have meant nothing. But in the corridors of post-revolutionary Africa, where shadows speak louder than diplomats, those words echoed like gunfire. In a church, Traoré didn't move immediately. He just stared at the crimson envelope again, still open, still bleeding questions. Then, with a sharp breath, he walked fast, quiet. The heels of his military boots struck the marble floor like distant thunder as Colonel Farouk led him downstairs. Through a series of darkened halls beneath the palace, down in the war room. Beneath layers of concrete and surveillance jammers, sat 2 unfamiliar figures. No flags, no bodyguards. Just suits, charcoal gray, thick accents. Their documents Iranian diplomatic clearance, Tehran issued. But their posture, military. One was former IRGC, the other, likely Besiege, based on the faded scar under his eye. Traoré said nothing at first. He simply took the seat. Across from them, the table between them was wide, wooden, worn by years of revolutions and betrayals. The older man nodded respectfully, sliding over a black leather folder. Inside, satellite imagery. Not of Israel, not of Iran, but of Djibouti, Eritrea, and Kenya. Israeli-linked intelligence hubs, drone ports, listening stations. These, the man said in accented French, are not African bases. They are colonial extensions. Then came the pitch. Iran was preparing something massive. A multi-front retaliation against Israel and its allies, sparked by recent escalations in Gaza and Lebanon. But this time, they didn't want to act alone or be predictable. They wanted Africa, not for soldiers, not even for airspace, but for sympathy, for cover. For a voice that could stand on the world stage and say, "We were colonized. We were looted, now we stand with the oppressed no matter where they are." And if Traoré accepted, Iran would provide drone jammers, Russian-compatible radar systems, and encryption upgrades to neutralize French and American eavesdropping. They would offer oil deals off books via Oman and something else, intelligence on Burkina Faso's own dissidents, names, bank accounts, locations, bought from Mossad defectors and Lebanese contacts. What do you do when your enemy's enemy starts to feel like an ally and your so-called allies have never lifted a hand to help you rise? Traoré remained silent, but his jaw tightened. He remembered how France had turned its back on him, how ECOWAS had threatened invasion when he kicked out Western mercenaries, how Israel, through intermediaries, had armed factions destabilizing Mali and Niger as neighbors. His struggle now, Iran was offering more than military aid. They were offering validation and vengeance. But Farouk shifted uneasily beside him. The colonel, a pragmatist, had seen these games before. He leaned in and whispered, "Today they offer drones. Tomorrow they want bases." Traoré didn't answer. Instead, he asked the Iranians, "Why me?" The older man smiled thinly. "Because Africa listens to you now because you are not afraid. And because one day, when Tel Aviv burns, the world will need a new voice to say it was justice, not terror." Suddenly, silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Traoré stood, slowly pushing the black folder back across the table. "You will receive my answer, not in words, but in what I choose to do next." The Iranians nodded. No handshakes. No smiles. They stood and left the war room without a word, just like they had arrived that night. Traoré didn't sleep. He sat alone in his study, watching the desert wind blow dust across the presidential courtyard. The letter still lay on his desk. Beside it now sat a framed photo of Thomas Sankara, the Burkinabe revolutionary leader murdered by betrayal in 1987. Sankara had refused foreign aid, refused puppet strings, and he died for it. What is the cost of saying no? What is the price of saying yes? And in a world where power whispers behind closed doors, who decides the meaning of freedom anymore? The next morning, a drone was spotted flying low over Burkina Faso's eastern airspace. Not French, not American. Israeli, confirmed by radar signature. Was it a warning or a test? A single drone, silent, unarmed. But its message roared louder than any missile. "We see you." The Israeli drone, Hermes 900, circled once over the skies of Fada, then vanished westward. It didn't fire. It didn't even jam. But within 10 minutes, it was logged by Burkina Faso's Russian-supplied radar systems. Captain Traoré stared at the data feed. The drone had passed directly over an area just 60 kilometers from a Quds Force sympathizer camp, a place Iran had discreetly suggested they could use if he gave the green light. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message someone already knew back in the capital. The Minister of Defense, a seasoned general from the Sankara era, demanded answers. Why was a hostile drone allowed this deep into our airspace? He growled, slamming a report onto the table. But Traoré didn't flinch. He knew what they all feared, but would never say aloud, "Because they're watching how I respond," he said calmly, "because everyone is waiting to see if we become the spark." That evening, Traoré made a quiet, deliberate move. He summoned Fatima Zongo, his trusted advisor on regional strategy and an intelligence veteran who had once worked with ECOWAS. He laid the letter from Iran on her desk. She read it silently, then looked up, her face pale. "If you go east, there's no coming back," she said. "I know. And if you don't go, they might force your hand anyway. They never extend invitations they can afford to let be refused." Fatima opened a thin leather folder of her own. Inside, transcripts, calls intercepted from Abidjan and Tel Aviv. One in particular stood out. "If Traoré aligns with Iran, we activate the Chad contingency. No more hesitation. AFRICOM will support a neutralization. Neutralization, not diplomacy, not sanctions. Is this what sovereignty looks like? Choosing between being a pawn or a target? The next morning, Traoré did something unexpected. He left the palace. No press, no convoy, just a small security team and an old military truck. He drove east, deep into the Sahel, toward a village called Tenkodogo. It was a town forgotten by most governments, bombed by militants, ignored by the West. And Yetit was where he had once promised that no Burkinabe child will die of hunger while foreign companies feast on our soil. In the marketplace, under a thatched roof, he sat with elders. He didn't mention Iran, or Israel, or war. He asked one question. If the world came to our door asking us to fight in a war that is not ours, but promised us power in return, what would you say? An old man, blind in one eye, simply replied, "When elephants fight, the grass suffers. But when the antelope joins in, it dies first." Back in Ouagadougou, the embassy channels buzzed. France requested an urgent consultation. The UAE offered a discreet weapons deal to ensure balance. The United States, through backdoor channels, requested a private virtual meeting with Traoré and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Too many eyes, too many ears. And yet, no one saw what Traoré did next. Late that night, in a dim hangar on the outskirts of the capital, Traoré ordered a decoy convoy to move south toward Ghana. It was meant to be seen by surveillance drones deliberately. Meanwhile, he boarded a Russian-built May helicopter and flew west to Bobo-Dioulasso. A quiet meeting was waiting, not with Iran, not with Israel, but with an Algerian mediator, someone who once sat in the same room as Qasem Soleimani, and later negotiated with Mossad on a failed prisoner exchange. This man came with only one item, a sealed black case. Inside, a burner phone, preloaded with one number. The message was clear. Iran was waiting, and they would not ask again. When your silence becomes a decision, and your delay becomes a declaration. How long before the world answers for you? As dawn broke over the Sahel, Traoré stood alone on the runway, in his hand. The black phone, still off. Behind him, a country bracing for the storm no one wanted to name. In front of him, a question that had no easy answer. Every war begins with a decision, but sometimes it's the decision not to act that rewrites history. That morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré held the phone that could start a chain reaction across continents. One call, one connection, one side. Chosen, but he didn't press the button. The black burner phone rested cold in Traoré's hand as the wind swept across the airfield in Bobo-Dioulasso. The rotor blades of the helicopter behind him had stopped. Silence surrounded him, broken only by the soft calls of distant birds and the faint hum of dawn. Inside that silence, tension lived. His thumb hovered over the single number pre-programmed into the phone. Tehran Command Quads, Liaison Line. It wasn't just a number, it was a contract, a silent declaration that Africa had chosen a side, not neutrality. Not non-alignment, but resistance. If he dialed within 48 hours, Iranian military advisors would begin arriving in neighboring Mali. Within 72 hours, a disinformation campaign would launch across the Sahel, pinning the drone strike on Israeli provocation. And within 1 week, Burkina Faso would become a strategic node in Iran's clandestine war. But Traoré never pressed the button. Instead, he did something else. He removed the SIM card, crushed it beneath his boot, and handed the blank phone to his advisor. "Fatima, let them wonder," he said quietly. "So, is that a no?" she asked. "It's not a yes. Sometimes, in geopolitics, the most powerful weapon isn't a missile or a drone. It's mystery. It's silence. It's making the enemy unsure of your next move." By the end of that week, no statements were made from the Burkinabe government. But something else happened. 2 Iranian diplomats were quietly denied entry at the border. An Israeli reconnaissance drone was mysteriously jammed over the west, forced to land, and Burkina Faso announced a closed-door summit of Sahel nations. To review the sovereignty of international military partnerships, the international media tried to make sense of it. Was Traoré aligning with Iran? Was he posturing for leverage with the West? Or was he playing all sides to buy time? No one knew, and that's exactly how he wanted it. In Tehran, silence from Traoré was taken as a challenge, not an insult, not a refusal, but a question. Can you afford to wait for me? Inside Iran's Quds Force Command Center, General Khani stood in front of a digital map of North Africa. Next to him, a closed dossier. Traoré's photo still on the cover. He hasn't answered. One aide said, "No," Khani replied, "but he hasn't refused. That's worse, because refusal brings clarity. But silence, that brings chaos. And in chaos, nations collapse or rise." 3 weeks later, an anonymous leak emerged online, a video poorly shot, distorted audio. Two of the Iranian envoys from Ouagadougou sitting in a cafe in Niamey. One of them saying, "If he delays much longer, we move to plan B, with or without him." The video went viral in underground circles. Across Israel, Mossad agents scrambled to assess, was a new African front about to open? In Washington, a CIA cable warned, Burkina Faso remains a strategic unknown. Do not assume alignment, prepare contingencies. Meanwhile, inside his palace in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood again by the window, rain streaking the glass. On his desk lay 2 new envelopes. One, marked Confidential Joint French Mission. The other, unmarked, containing a handwritten note in Farsi. He didn't open either. Instead, he turned to a piece of paper and began writing. Not to Tehran, not to Tel Aviv, but to the African Union. A letter calling for a new defense. Aligned to East or West, but Africa first. A league of neutral nations, armed with tech, strategy, and one mission: to stay sovereign in the coming storm. Fatima entered the room. "Still no word from Iran?" she asked. Traoré looked up. "They said they'd call. Maybe they realized. I'm not theirs to summon." And so the night passed. No war began, no missiles fell, no alliances were declared. But the silence, it was louder than bombs. What happens next, when Tehran gets tired of waiting? When Israel decides waiting is too dangerous? When a quiet African leader, either ally nor enemy, holds the balance of the next great conflict in his hands? Because sometimes the war doesn't begin with a missile. It begins with a man who refuses to choose.